The will to power. An attempted transvaluation of all values.
Friedrich Nietzsche.
First book. European Nihilism. Nihilism. 1. Nihilism as an outcome of the valuations and interpretations of existence which have prevailed heretofore. 2. What does nihilism mean? That the highest values are losing their value. There is no born. There is no answer to the question, to what purpose? 3. Thorough nihilism is the conviction that life is absurd. In the light of the highest values already discovered, it also includes the view that we have not the smallest right to assume the existence of transcendental objects or things in themselves, which would be either divine or morality incarnate. This view is a result of fully developed truthfulness, therefore a consequence of the belief in morality. 4. What advantages did the Christian hypothesis of morality offer? It bestowed an intrinsic value upon men, which contrasted with their apparent insignificance and subordination to chance in the eternal flux of becoming and perishing. It served the purpose of God's advocates, inasmuch as it granted the world a certain perfection despite its sorrow and evil. It also granted the world that proverbial freedom. Evil seemed full of meaning. It assumed that man could have a knowledge of absolute values, and thus granted him adequate perception for the most important things. It prevented man from despising himself as man, from turning against life, and from being driven to despair by knowledge. It was a self-preservative measure. In short, morality was the great antidote against practical and theoretical nihilism. 5. But among the forces reared by morality, there was truthfulness. This in the end turns against morality, exposes the teleology of the latter, its interestedness, and now the recognition of this lie so long incorporated, from which we despaired of ever freeing ourselves, acts just like a stimulus. We perceive certain needs in ourselves, implanted during the long dynasty of the moral interpretation of life, which now seem to us to be needs of untruth. On the other hand, those very needs represent the highest values owing to which we are able to endure life. We have ceased from attaching any worth to what we know, and we dare not attach any more worth to that with which we would fain deceive ourselves. From this antagonism there results a process of dissolution. 6. This is the antinomy. In so far as we believe in morality, we condemn existence. 7. The highest values in the service of which man ought to live, more particularly when they oppressed and constrained him most, these social values, owing to their tone-strengthening tendencies, were built over men's heads as though they were the will of God or reality, or the actual world, or even a hope of a world to come. Now that the lowly origin of these values has become known, the whole universe seems to have been transvalued and to have lost its significance. But this is only an intermediate stage. 8. The consequence of nihilism, disbelief in all values, as a result of a moral valuation, we have grown to dislike egotism, even though we have realized the impossibility of altruism. We have grown to dislike what is most necessary, although we have recognized the impossibility of a liberum arbitrium and of an intelligible freedom. We perceive that we do not reach the spheres in which we have set our values. At the same time, those other spheres in which we live have not thereby gained one iota in value. On the contrary, we are tired, because we have lost the main incentive to live. All in vain hitherto. 9. Pessimism as a preparatory state to nihilism. 10. Pessimism viewed as strength, in what respect? In the energy of its logic, as anarchy, nihilism, and analysis. B. Pessimism regarded as collapse, in what sense? In the sense of its being a softening influence, a sort of cosmopolitan befingering, tau comprender, and historical spirit. Critical tension, extremes make their appearance and become dominant. 11. The logic of pessimism leads finally to nihilism. What is the force at work? The notion that there are no values and no purpose, the recognition of the part that moral valuations have played in all other lofty values. Result: moral valuations are condemnations, negations. Morality is the abdication of the will to live. 12. The collapse of cosmopolitan values. A. Nihilism will have to manifest itself as a psychological condition, first when we have sought in all that has happened a purpose which is not there, so that the seeker will ultimately lose courage. Nihilism is therefore the coming into consciousness of the long waste of strength, the pain of futility, uncertainty, the lack of an opportunity to recover in some way, or to attain to a state of peace concerning anything, shame in one's own presence, as if one had cheated oneself too long. The purpose above mentioned might have been achieved, in the form of a realization of a most high canon of morality in all worldly phenomena, the moral order of the universe, or in the form of the increase of love and harmony in the traffic of humanity, or in the nearer approach to a general condition of happiness, or even in the march towards general nonentity. Any sort of goal always constitutes a purpose. The common factor to all these appearances is that something will be attained, through the process itself, and now we perceive that becoming has been aiming at nothing, and has achieved nothing. Hence the disillusionment in regard to a so-called purpose in existence, as a cause of nihilism, whether this be in respect of a very definite purpose, or generalized into the recognition that all the hypotheses are false which have hitherto been offered as to the object of life, and which relate to the whole of evolution, man no longer an assistant in, let alone the culmination of, the evolutionary process. Nihilism will manifest itself as a psychological condition, in the second place, when man has fixed a totality, a systematization, even an organization in and behind all phenomena, so that the soul thirsting for respect and admiration will wallow in the general idea of a highest ruling and administrative power. If it be the soul of a logician, the sequence of consequences and perfect reasoning will suffice to conciliate everything. A kind of unity, some form of monism, and as a result of this belief man becomes obsessed by a feeling of profound relativity and dependence in the presence of an all which is infinitely superior to him, a sort of divinity. The general good exacts the surrender of the individual. But lo, there is no such general good. At bottom, man loses the belief in his own worth when no infinitely precious entity manifests itself through him. That is to say, he conceived such an all, in order to be able to believe in his own worth. Nihilism, as a psychological condition, has yet a third and last form. Admitting these 2 points of view, that no purpose can be assigned to becoming, and that no great entity rules behind all becoming, in which the individual may completely lose himself as in an element of superior value, there still remains the subterfuge which would consist in condemning this whole world of becoming as an illusion, and in discovering a world which would lie beyond it, and would be a real world. The moment, however, that man perceives that this world has been devised only for the purpose of meeting certain psychological needs, and that he has no right whatsoever to it, the final form of nihilism comes into being, which comprises a denial of a metaphysical world, and which forbids itself all belief in a real world. From this standpoint, the reality of becoming is the only reality that is admitted, all bypaths to backworlds and false godheads are abandoned, but this world is no longer endured, although no one wishes to disown it. What has actually happened? The feeling of worthlessness was realized when it was understood that neither the notion of purpose, nor that of unity, nor that of truth could be made to interpret the general character of existence. Nothing is achieved or obtained thereby, the unity which intervenes in the multiplicity of events is entirely lacking. The character of existence is not true, it is false. There is certainly no longer any reason to believe in a real world. In short, the categories, purpose, unity, being, by means of which we had lent some worth to life, we have once more divorced from it, and the world now appears worthless to us. b. Admitting that we have recognized the impossibility of interpreting world by means of these three categories, and that from this standpoint the world begins to be worthless to us, we must ask ourselves whence we derived our belief in these three categories. Let us see if it is possible to refuse to believe in them. If we can deprive them of their value, the proof that they cannot be applied to the world is no longer a sufficient reason for depriving that world of its value. Result: the belief in the categories of reason is the cause of nihilism. We have measured the worth of the world according to categories which can only be applied to a purely fictitious world. Conclusion: all values with which we have tried, hitherto, to lend the world some worth, from our point of view, and with which we have therefore deprived it of all worth, once these values have been shown to be inapplicable, all these values are, psychologically, the results of certain views of utility established for the purpose of maintaining and increasing the dominion of certain communities, but falsely projected into the nature of things. It is always man's exaggerated ingenuousness to regard himself as the sense and measure of all things. 13. Nihilism represents an intermediary pathological condition, the vast generalization, the conclusion that there is no purpose in anything, is pathological, whether it be that the productive forces are not yet strong enough, or that decadence still hesitates and has not yet discovered its expedients. The conditions of this hypothesis, that there is no truth, that there is no absolute state of affairs, no thing in itself. This alone is nihilism, and of the most extreme kind. It finds that the value of things consists precisely in the fact that these values are not real and never have been real, but that they are only a symptom of strength on the part of the valuer, a simplification serving the purposes of existence. 14. Values and their modification are related to the growth of power of the valuer. The measure of disbelief and of the freedom of spirit which is tolerated, viewed as an expression of the growth of power. Nihilism, viewed as the ideal of the highest spiritual power, of the overrich life, partly destructive, partly ironical. 15. What is belief? How is a belief born? All belief assumes that something is true. The extremist form of nihilism would mean that all belief, all assumption of truth, is false, because no real world is at hand. It were therefore only an appearance seen in perspective, whose origin must be found in us, seeing that we are constantly in need of a narrower, a shortened, and simplified world. This should be realized, that the extent to which we can, in our heart of hearts, acknowledge appearance, and the necessity of falsehood, without going to rack and ruin, is the measure of strength. In this respect, nihilism, in that it is the negation of a real world and of being, might be a divine view of the world. 16. If we are disillusioned, we have not become so in regard to life, but owing to the fact that our eyes have been opened to all kinds of desiderata. With mocking anger we survey that which is called ideal. We despise ourselves only because we are unable at every moment of our lives to quell that absurd emotion which is called idealism. This pampering by means of ideals is stronger than the anger of the disillusioned one. 17. To what extent does Schopenhauerian nihilism continue to be the result of the same ideal as that which gave rise to Christian theism? The amount of certainty concerning the most exalted desiderata, the highest values and the greatest degree of perfection, was so great, that the philosophers started out from it as if it had been an a priori and absolute fact, God at the head, as the given quantity, truth. To become like God, to be absorbed into the divine being, these were for centuries the most ingenious and most convincing desiderata, but that which convinces is not necessarily true on that account. It is nothing more nor less than convincing. An observation for donkeys. The granting of a personal reality to this accretion of ideals has been unlearned. People have become atheistic. But has the ideal actually been abandoned? The latest metaphysicians, as a matter of fact, still seek their true reality in it, the thing in itself, beside which everything else is merely appearance. Their dogma is that because our world of appearance is so obviously not the expression of that ideal, it therefore cannot be true, and at bottom does not even lead back to that metaphysical world as cause. The unconditioned, insofar as it stands for that highest degree of perfection, cannot possibly be the reason of all the conditioned. Schopenhauer, who desired it otherwise, was obliged to imagine this metaphysical basis as the antithesis to the ideal, as an evil, blind will. Thus it could be that which appears, that which manifests itself in the world of appearance. But even so, he did not give up that ideal absolute, he circumvented it. 18. The most general sign of modern times, in his own estimation, man has lost an infinite amount of dignity. For a long time he was the center and tragic hero of life in general, then he endeavored to demonstrate at least his relationship to the most essential and in itself most valuable side of life, as all metaphysicians do, who wish to hold fast to the dignity of man, in their belief that moral values are cardinal values. He who has let God go, clings all the more strongly to the belief in morality. 19. Every purely moral valuation, as, for instance, the Buddhistic, terminates in nihilism. Europe must expect the same thing. It is supposed that one can get along with a morality bereft of a religious background, but in this direction the road to nihilism is opened. There is nothing in religion which compels us to regard ourselves as valuing creatures. 20. The question which nihilism puts, namely, to what purpose, is the outcome of a habit, hitherto, to regard the purpose as something fixed, given and exacted from outside, that is to say, by some supernatural authority. Once the belief in this has been unlearned, the force of an old habit leads to the search after another authority which would know how to speak unconditionally, and could point to goals and missions. The authority of the conscience now takes the first place. The more morality is emancipated from theology, the more imperative does it become, as a compensation for the personal authority. Or the authority of reason. Or the gregarious instinct, the herd. Or history with its immanent spirit, which has its goal in itself, and to which one can abandon oneself. One would like to evade the will, as also the willing of a goal and the risk of setting oneself a goal. One would like to get rid of the responsibility, fatalism would be accepted. Finally, happiness, and with a dash of humbug, the happiness of the greatest number. It is said. 1. A definite goal is quite unnecessary. 2. Such a goal cannot possibly be foreseen. Precisely now, when will in its fullest strength were necessary, it is in the weakest and most pusillanimous condition. Absolute mistrust concerning the organizing power of the will. 21. The perfect nihilist. The nihilist's eye idealizes in an ugly sense and is inconstant to what it remembers. It allows its recollections to go astray and to fade. It does not protect them from the cadaverous coloration with which weakness dyes all that is distant and past. And what it does not do for itself it fails to do for the whole of mankind as well, that is to say, it allows it to drop. 22. Nihilism. It may be two things. A. Nihilism as a sign of enhanced spiritual strength, Active nihilism. B. Nihilism as a sign of the collapse and decline of spiritual strength. Passive nihilism. 23. Nihilism, a normal condition. It may be a sign of strength. Spiritual vigor may have increased to such an extent that the goals toward which man has marched hitherto, the convictions, articles of faith, are no longer suited to it, for a faith generally expresses the exigencies of the conditions of existence, a submission to the authority of an order of things which conduces to the prosperity, the growth and power of a living creature. On the other hand, a sign of insufficient strength to fix a goal, wherefore, and a faith for itself. It reaches its maximum of relative strength as a powerful destructive force in the form of active nihilism. Its opposite would be weary nihilism, which no longer attacks, its most renowned form being Buddhism, as passive nihilism, a sign of weakness. Spiritual strength may be fatigued, exhausted, so that the goals and values which have prevailed hitherto are no longer suited to it and are no longer believed in, so that the synthesis of values and goals, upon which every strong culture stands, decomposes, and the different values contend with one another, disintegration, then everything which is relieving, which heals, becomes, or stupefies, steps into the foreground under the cover of various disguises, either religious, moral, political or aesthetic, etc. 24. Nihilism is not only a meditating over the in vain, not only the belief that everything deserves to perish, but one actually puts one's shoulder to the plough, one destroys. This, if you will, is illogical, but the nihilist does not believe in the necessity of being logical. It is the condition of strong minds and wills, and to these it is impossible to be satisfied with the negation of judgment. The negation by deeds proceeds from their nature. Annihilation by the reasoning faculty seconds annihilation by the hand. 25. Concerning the genesis of the nihilist. The courage of all one really knows comes but late in life. It is only quite recently that I have acknowledged to myself that heretofore I have been a nihilist from top to toe. The energy and thoroughness with which I marched forward as a nihilist deceived me concerning this fundamental principle. When one is progressing towards a goal, it seems impossible that aimlessness per se should be one's fundamental article of faith. 26. The pessimism of strong natures. That, wherefore, after a terrible struggle, even after victory, that something may exist which is 100 times more important than the question whether we feel well or unwell, is the fundamental instinct of all strong natures, and consequently too, whether the others feel well or unwell. In short, that we have a purpose, for which we would not even hesitate to sacrifice men, run all risks, and bend our backs to the worst. This is the great passion.